A gunshot explodes through the night. And before anyone understands what's happening, a female veteran hurls herself in front of the Hells Angels boss, taking the bullet straight to the stomach. She drops to her knees, gasping, blood soaking through her shirt. The biker she just saved falls beside her, hands shaking as he checks the wound. Then his face hardens. He rises slowly, fury boiling through him, and he lifts one hand into the air, giving a silent signal. Within seconds, engines ignite everywhere. An entire swarm of bikers roaring toward them like a storm answering a call. Why was she protecting him? Who fired the shot? And why did that single signal unleash a citywide hunt? Hit subscribe to Heart Tales. This story only gets wilder. Let's check in. 1 for first-time viewer, 2 if you've seen a few, 3 if you never miss. The gunshot tore the dusk open before anyone understood where it came from. Elena Ward didn't think. She didn't breathe. She didn't wait for a second shot to confirm what her instincts screamed a full second before the sound reached the crowd. She launched forward. One moment Blake Riker stood on the platform, backlit by the last dull glimmer of evening, ready to speak. The next, Elena's shoulder crashed into his ribs, knocking him off balance as a bullet ripped through the air they had occupied a heartbeat earlier. The impact hit her like a hammer. A punch of heat exploded through her left side, the force of it folding her body mid-motion. Her breath shattered in her throat. She tasted blood before she hit the ground. Blake went down beneath her, his arms coming up too late, shock flaring across his face. The world didn't slow, it snapped. Shouts erupted across the rally grounds. Deep, guttural, terrified voices layered over the thunder of boots scrambling against pavement. Headlights flared on instinct, slicing through the half-dark with violent brightness. Engines roared awake until the entire lot became a living, snarling animal made of steel and fury. "Elena!" Blake's voice rumbled from somewhere beneath her, strained with disbelief, anger, something rawer than either. He rolled her gently, hands steady but trembling, trying to see how bad it was. She blinked hard, fighting the pull of darkness as her fingers curled weakly into the front of his cut. "Roof," she breathed. "North side." Her voice was thin, but it carried. Blake followed her gaze immediately, and when he saw movement on the distant rooftop, a figure rising, rifle retracting, his entire expression changed. Fear vanished. Something colder replaced it. Blake stood so fast the blood on his hands streaked down his wrists. The shooter was already sprinting across the rooftop edge, slipping into shadow, but that didn't matter. Blake raised one arm and pointed toward the escaping silhouette. He didn't need to shout. The bikers understood. 120 engines roared as if pulled by the same invisible thread. Men were already on their bikes, helmets barely buckled, tires screaming against the asphalt as they surged toward every exit of the lot. "Elena's down! Get medics now!" Jackson Creed's voice cut sharply through the chaos as he dropped to his knees beside her, hands pressing hard against the wound. "Stay with me! Stay awake! Don't you dare disappear on me!" Elena tried to inhale, but the breath trembled halfway in her chest. Pain rolled through her ribs in hot waves, but she focused on the night sky above her, the faint line of light left behind by the last sunset. Her fingertips twitched against Jackson's arm. "I'm fine," she whispered, though she wasn't. "Go after him." "No," Jackson snarled. "Not happening. They're hunting. You're not dying in a parking lot under a broken light bulb." She almost laughed, but the sound dissolved into a gasp. Boots skidded to a stop beside her as medics rushed forward, club members with training, hands-efficient, movements practiced. They slid their arms under her shoulders and legs, lifting her onto a makeshift stretcher pulled from the back of a gear truck. Someone pressed a jacket under her head. Someone else kept pressure on the wound. Voices moved around her in sharp bursts, orders, curses, promises. Blake reappeared above her, eyes burning, jaw locked. The dusk painted his face in shadows and gold, making him look carved from the night itself. "Elena," he murmured, and something in his voice cracked. "You didn't have to do that." She forced her eyes open enough to meet his. "Yes," she whispered, "I did." For a single moment, just one, Blake let emotion move across his face. Softness, guilt, fury, fear, 100 things he didn't have time to name. Then he swallowed them whole and straightened. "Get her to the hospital," he ordered. "Jax, you go with her. Don't leave her side." Jackson nodded, already climbing into the van as medics slid Elena inside. The doors slammed shut, and the engine growled to life as the vehicle tore away from the lot, headlights carving a path through the violet darkness. Blake watched until the red taillights vanished. Then he turned back to the bikes, to the hunt, to the man who tried to end his life and nearly ended hers. His hand hovered above the handlebars of the nearest bike. He closed his fingers around the grip, exhaled once, slow and deadly calm, and swung into the seat. The bikers formed around him instantly. 2 columns, headlights pointed forward like twin rows of angry stars. "Shooter heading north!" someone shouted over the roar, moving fast across Rooftops. Teams 2 and 3 cut him off on Raymond Street, closed the intersections. Blake flipped down his visor and twisted the throttle. The bike snarled beneath him, eager, violent, alive. He spoke into the radio one time. "He took a shot at family," Blake said. "Run him off the earth." Engines detonated together. Bikes shot forward, tearing out of the lot in a flood of noise and steel. Tires screamed as riders leaned into the first sharp turn, weaving through traffic with reckless precision. Headlights blurred into streaks of white, illuminating the darkening streets in jagged flashes. Some pedestrians froze, some screamed, cars braked hard, horns blaring. But none of it stopped the pack. They were hunting, and Blake was leading them. Wind tore at his jacket as he blasted down the street, eyes locked on the rooftop line where the shooter, a shadow wearing the shape of a man, darted from ledge to ledge, vanishing behind chimneys and reappearing between gaps. Blake didn't blink, didn't breathe, didn't care about anything except the blood on his hands that wasn't his. He leaned forward, voice low, vibrating with something colder than rage. "You're not getting away. Not tonight. Not after touching her life." He opened the throttle all the way, and the bike roared like a living creature as the chase exploded into the night. Blake Riker didn't feel the cold of the night. He didn't feel the vibration of the engine beneath him, or the wind clawing at his jacket, or the sting in his eyes from the speed. All he felt was the memory of Elena's fingers slipping from his wrist as the medics rushed her away. Every second since then had been a countdown. Ahead of him, the city opened like a maze pulled tight under the violet sky. Pools of light from street lamps flickered across the asphalt, stretching long shadows that twisted as the swarm of bikes tore through the streets. Horns blared, tires skidded, but nothing slowed them. They were a storm with a single target, and Blake was the center of it. "Shooter is moving north along the rooftops." A voice crackled through his radio. "Fast! He's using back alleys to drop between buildings. Copy," Blake answered, voice low. "Teams, spread the grid. Close every cross street to Raymond." 120 engines shifted in unison like a single organism. They broke into squads, splitting off through side streets, forming barricades at intersections, driving cars aside with the sheer force of sound and momentum. Pedestrians filmed with shaking hands as riders thundered past. Someone screamed at the sight, so many bikes, so many lights cutting through the dark, that they dove back against a shop door. Cars pulled to the curb to avoid being swallowed by the pack. Blake ignored all of it. He tracked the shooter by instinct, not by sight, not by sound. Instinct. Years of reading movement, understanding desperation, knowing how a man runs when he's not trying to escape, but trying to outpace his own fear. The shooter, Draven Korvich, wasn't panicking, he was executing a plan. Blake could feel that long before he could see him. "Team 2, Blake called. "He's moving toward the industrial strip. Get eyes above the rail line. On it, moving now." Blake cut hard to the right, sparks flying as his foot grazed the asphalt. The bike fishtailed for a breath, caught traction, and kicked forward even faster. He saw the rooftop movement just as the shooter leapt from one building to the next, a dark silhouette framed against the weak glow of a warehouse sign flickering in the distance. "There!" a rider shouted from somewhere behind. "Roof across Jackson!" Blake's jaw flexed. Block every exit beneath him. He's not getting down unless he jumps into our arms. Copy! The roar of the bikes behind him rose, a chorus of fury echoing across the empty side streets. Riders veered between rows of parked cars, engines screaming as they shot through gaps barely wide enough for their handlebars. The shooter crossed a rooftop and disappeared behind a metal ventilation tower. Blake killed his headlights. He didn't want the shooter to know how close he was. The others caught on immediately. One by one, the bikes behind him dimmed their lights, plunging the street into a tunnel of darkness lit only by scraps of moonlight. The sound was enough. The sound was everything. A pack of predators running low, silent, close to the ground. Blake accelerated, hugging the shadows beneath fire escapes and sagging balconies. His eyes locked on the rooftops again. The shooter reappeared, vaulting a narrow gap, landing hard on the gravel-coated surface of the next building. Good, hard landings meant strain. Strain meant mistakes. Blake didn't wait for the mistake. He reached for the radio again. Team 3, cut left through the factory yard. He's going to hit the bottleneck, near the crane yard. "How do you know?" someone asked. "Because that's where I'd go." He throttled harder. The bike roared back into life beneath him, lunging forward with a vengeance. Wind whipped his hair back, tugged at his cut, but he didn't blink. His pulse stayed steady, slow. It was the kind of calm that came only when purpose hollowed out everything else inside a man. The shooter dropped suddenly from the rooftop, landing in the narrow alley between two old brick warehouses, disappearing into shadow. "Target on ground level," another rider shouted. "He's moving south, no, east toward the docks." Blake saw the movement a fraction of a second later, the shooter's dark outline sprinting through the alley, darting between trash bins, leaping over a fallen fence panel, weaving through the maze of the industrial district. Blake kicked the bike into gear and slid through the turn so sharply his boot sparked against the ground. He followed. The alleyway exploded with noise as his bike tore through it, metal rattling, stray papers flying into the air, old bolts skittering across concrete. The shooter glanced back for the first time, and for that split second Blake saw the man's face. Calm, focused, still hunting for his next step. He wasn't scared. That made Blake's blood boil hotter than anything else. He lifted the radio again. "Teams on Harbor Lane, cut him off. Don't let him hit the water. Copy. We're almost." The radio cut off with the screech of tires. Blake swung out of the alley and onto Harbor Lane just in time to see two of his riders blocking the shooter's path. Bikes positioned diagonally, engines snarling, riders braced like anchors. Draven didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward a stack of shipping crates, grabbed the edge of the lowest container, and hauled himself up with a speed that shocked even Blake. Within seconds, he was climbing like a man who'd practiced the route 100 times. Blake cursed under his breath. He knew exactly what this meant. "He's leading us," Blake growled. "This is a route. He planned this. Everyone hold formation, don't get funneled. But Draven was already moving, scaling the crates, leaping to the next row, then dropping down the far side where the cranes loomed over the abandoned loading dock like giant skeletons frozen mid-task. Blake spun the bike and followed. The night exploded with motion. Trucks, steel beams, stacked pallets, shadow-filled aisles between crates. Draven wove through all of it, fast, nimble, desperate to stay ahead but still too controlled to be fleeing blindly. He was running toward something, and Blake was beginning to fear he knew what. "Team 3, Blake shouted over the roar of engines. "Close the crane yard now! Already on it!" But Blake knew it was too late. Draven reached the edge of the yard, vaulted a fence, and vanished into the darkness beyond, toward Pier 17, where the labyrinth of loading docks and rusted machinery made perfect ground for an ambush. Blake slammed the brakes, skidding to a stop just before the fence. Gravel sprayed beneath his tires. His breath came hard, chest heaving. For the first time since the chase began, he felt the sick twist of understanding settle in his gut. This wasn't escape. This was invitation. Draven Korvik wasn't running from them. He was leading them to someone. Blake stared into the dark path ahead, jaw tightening. "Elena!" he whispered under his breath, as if the word itself could steady him. He lifted the radio again. "All squads," Blake said. "Pier 17 is the kill zone. Behind him, 120 bikes slowed, just enough to hear him when he added, with a voice colder than the night itself, "We're going in." Blake didn't wait for the engines behind him to settle. The moment he finished speaking, he twisted the throttle and launched himself toward Pier 17 like a blade slicing through the dark. The others followed instantly, headlights flicking back on in a staggered wave that washed the industrial district in cold, white bursts of light. The road to the pier narrowed into a long stretch between abandoned factories. Broken windows reflected the glare of the bikes in jagged fragments, as if 100 eyes watched them pass. Gravel cracked beneath the tires. Rusted fences rattled in their wake. The night air grew heavier, colder, almost metallic. Draven had vanished ahead, no rooftops now, nowhere high to climb. He had slipped into the ground-level maze of cargo yards, where shadows were deeper and sound carried in unpredictable ways. "Spread out," Blake ordered, "but don't separate too far. He wants choke points." Engines answered, not voices. They split into smaller formations, 3 lines cutting through the maze from different angles, weaving around cranes frozen in place, past stacks of containers tall enough to blot out what little moonlight remained. Water lapped softly somewhere ahead, a slow, uneven rhythm against the docks. Blake felt it in his bones. They were close. The shooter wasn't ahead. He was here. They pushed deeper. The lights from the street vanished behind them. The pier swallowed the world in shadow, broken only by their sweeping headlights moving like search beams over metal and concrete. Every turn narrowed. Every open space felt like a trap disguised as a gift. A rider to Blake's left lifted a hand. Movement, high on the far side. Blake spun his bike, headlights slicing across the upper scaffolding of a loading crane. A shape darted behind a support beam. Fast, low, deliberate. "Top gantry," one rider muttered into the radio. "He's circling." "No," Blake said under his breath. "He's watching." The pack slowed as they reached the central yard, an open stretch flanked by 3 container towers and a rusted cargo crane leaning at a precarious angle. Metal groaned softly as the wind pushed through the beams. The entire space felt too still. Blake cut the engine. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It vibrated, because the killer had been running all night, but for the first time he'd stopped. One by one, the other engines died, leaving the riders bathed in dim stray light, white bars from their headlights, orange halos from distant shipping lamps, a faint shimmer from the harbor's surface. The air smelled of wet metal, diesel, and something older. Rust, oil, history. Blake stepped off his bike and scanned the scaffolding. Draven Korvik stepped out from behind the crane's support structure. He moved like someone who knew exactly how much time he had left and wasn't afraid of it. The half-light carved a harsh edge along his cheekbones, revealing nothing but a calm, cold face. The rifle hung across his back now. He wasn't aiming it. He didn't need to. Blake's voice cut the space between them. "You shot the wrong person." Draven's smile was a thin slash. "No, I shot the one who moved first." That sentence landed like another bullet. A few riders cursed. One took a half step forward before Blake lifted a hand, silently ordering them to hold. Draven looked around at the swarm closing in, at the dozens of men who'd been chasing him for miles, their engines snarling, throats tight with rage. And yet he didn't look afraid. His eyes were sharp and calculating, like he was still measuring angles, escape lines, probabilities. "You followed well," he said. "Better than expected." "And you ran well," Blake replied. "But now you're out of Rooftops." Draven tilted his head. "Am I?" A hum rolled through the air. Low, mechanical, heavy. Blake's pulse spiked. He recognized that sound before the others did. Engines, not bikes. SUV engines. Reinforced, armored, built for collisions and ambushes. Blake spun just as the first black SUV barreled through the far fence, metal warping and screeching as it broke through the thin barrier. Its headlights flared on, flooding the yard with blinding white. Two more SUVs followed, smashing through the opposite side like battering rams. Riders shouted. Bikes roared back to life. "Move!" Blake barked. Tires screeched as the formation split, scattering seconds before the first SUV plowed through the space they'd occupied. Its grille slammed into a stack of pallets, splintering wood in an explosion of dust and shards. Draven didn't run this time. He walked toward the chaos. Two men jumped out of the nearest SUV, suits, tactical boots, faces unreadable in the half-light. They moved with precision, flanking Draven as he stepped behind their line of fire. Blake spun his bike, swerved between two charging vehicles, and skidded to a stop behind the cover of a shipping crate. Gunfire cracked through the night, short, controlled bursts from the men in suits, ricocheting sparks off metal. Riders dove behind bikes, behind crates, behind anything they could use as cover. The yard erupted into a battlefield. Blake's radio crackled with frantic voices, multiple hostiles, 5, no, 7, all armed. Watch the left side, SUV coming in hot. Where the hell did these guys come from? Blake didn't answer. He didn't need to. His eyes were locked on Draven, who stood untouched near the crane's base, watching the chaos he'd engineered. A trap, not just for Blake, for everyone wearing that patch. Draven met Blake's eyes and shrugged once, almost bored. "You chased me exactly where he wanted you to." Blake's breath froze in his chest. Not I. He didn't get time to ask. The floodlights at the far side of the pier snapped on all at once, harsh white beams slicing through the dark, illuminating the upper deck of a massive cargo ship moored at the dock. A man stood on the railing, tall, composed, hands in pockets, his silhouette carved into the light like a statue of the night itself. Blake recognized him instantly. Everyone in the city would have. Damien Cross, a philanthropist in daylight, something else entirely in darkness. He didn't raise his voice, didn't gesture, didn't move, but Blake felt the shift, like the whole pier belonged to this man, and always had. Then Cross spoke, calm and unhurried, voice carrying over the chaos with chilling clarity. "You should not have followed my stray." Draven smiled faintly at the word. Stray. Blake felt something cold settle deep inside his chest. This wasn't a chase. This was a board, and they were standing exactly where Cross wanted them. The gunfire paused for a breath, long enough for Cross to finish his sentence. "Tonight," he said, "you learn the cost of loyalty." The yard went silent, only for a heartbeat, then everything exploded again. Gunfire ripped the night apart. The first volley came from the left, sharp, disciplined bursts from Cross's men as they fanned out across the pier. The second wave came from the SUVs, headlights flaring as doors slammed open and more armed men poured into the yard with frightening precision. Blake Riker didn't flinch. He leaned his bike into a skid so violent sparks exploded beneath his boots as he slid behind a stack of steel drums. Bullets shredded the metal where his head had been a heartbeat earlier. Riders around him scrambled for cover, shouting warnings, engines snarling as some tried to reposition while others abandoned their bikes entirely. A man to his right fired back blindly, sparks ricocheting off a crane support. Blake grabbed him by the collar and yanked him down behind the drums. "Don't waste ammo," he snapped. "We're not shooting ghosts." The rider swallowed hard, nodding. His hands shook, but he steadied them. A second SUV screeched to Blake's left, fishtailing as it tried to pin a biker against the container wall. Blake darted out, sprinting low to the ground, and swung a heavy chain he'd ripped from a nearby winch moments earlier. It cracked across the SUV's windshield. The glass spiderwebbed instantly, headlights scattering into fractured beams. The driver swerved, panicked, and slammed the brakes, skidding sideways into a pallet stack. Blake didn't wait. He yanked the door open, dragged the dazed man out by his vest, and slammed him onto the concrete with a force that shook the ground. Gunfire rained overhead again. This time it wasn't coming from the SUVs. It was coming from the scaffolding. Draven Korvik had climbed halfway up the crane again, using the height not to escape, but to guide, to watch. His silhouette appeared and disappeared between beams as he pointed, signaling Cross's men where to move, a strategist on a killing field. Blake's fury burned hotter. He hit the radio. "Teams 5 and 6, break off and get elevation. I want snipers on those catwalks now. We're pinned!" Someone shouted back. "3 shooters on the high, gantry, then flank," Blake barked. "Take the ladder near the east wall." Another explosion shook the pier as one of the SUVs caught fire, flames licking the sky. Black smoke rolled across the yard, swallowing riders, silhouettes, containers. Everything painted in violent strobing flashes from muzzle fire. Someone screamed. Someone else didn't scream at all, just collapsed. Blake clenched his teeth. He refused to let the chaos drown him. He forced himself to see patterns through the fog, flank angles, choke points, gaps between firing arcs. He spotted Draven's path instantly. The shooter wasn't retreating. He was moving toward Cross, toward the ship, toward safety. Not happening. Blake sprinted from cover, weaving between containers with gunfire, chewing up the ground inches from his heels. A bullet grazed his shoulder, ripping through leather and leaving a hot streak across his skin. He barely felt it. He vaulted a fallen crate, rolled, came up running. He caught sight of Draven's boots on the crane ladder. One rung left before he could swing onto the catwalk leading toward the ship's upper deck. Blake reached the ladder and leapt, grabbing Draven's ankle. The shooter froze. For a fraction of a second, both men hung suspended, Draven halfway up the ladder, Blake anchored below, the entire world reduced to metal vibrating between their hands. Draven kicked hard. Blake tightened his grip, fingers digging through the fabric of Draven's pants. He yanked. Draven lost footing. He slammed back into the ladder, ribs cracking against steel. He hissed through clenched teeth, face twisting in pain, but he recovered fast, faster than Blake expected. He twisted, bracing one hand, and drove his heel downward into Blake's forearm. Pain exploded up Blake's arm. His grip loosened. Not enough to fall, just enough that Draven slipped upward, one rung, two, then swung himself onto the catwalk with a smoothness that should have been impossible for a man in pain. He turned to look down at Blake, breath ragged, face pale but smiling. "You follow well," Draven said, "but he predicted that. He predicted all of it." Blake's pulse hammered. Muscles screaming, he hauled himself up onto the ladder and began climbing after him. Draven didn't wait. He backed away along the catwalk, facing Blake the whole time, steps careful but confident. He didn't need to shoot, didn't need to fight, he just needed to reach Cross. Blake climbed faster. Below them the battle raged on, screams, engines, gunfire, metal clanging, men shouting orders. A biker fell and didn't rise. A second dragged him behind cover, bullets stitching a deadly path across the concrete. The ship's floodlights burned brighter now, turning the catwalk into a stage of shadows and harsh white, and Damien Cross watched from the railing above, calm, unmoving, hands still in his pockets. Blake reached the top of the ladder and swung himself onto the catwalk. Just as Draven struck, a metal pipe slammed against Blake's jaw, snapping his head sideways. Stars exploded in his vision. His footing slipped, one boot sliding off the grated walkway. He caught the railing at the last second, body dangling over sheer drop. Draven swung again. This time Blake blocked it, forearm taking the brunt of the impact. His arm shook violently, pain racing up the bone. He forced himself upright, teeth grinding, and landed a punch to Draven's ribs, right where he'd slammed into the ladder earlier. Draven choked on the impact. For the first time, Blake saw fear flicker, just a flicker, but enough. Blake grabbed him by the front of his jacket and slammed him into the railing so hard the entire catwalk shuddered. "You shot her!" Blake growled, breath hot, voice shaking with something that wasn't rage but lived next to it. "You tried to kill her." Draven grit his teeth. She moved in the way. Blake's fist tightened. He drew back. "Riker!" The voice came from above, smooth, measured, unhurried. Blake froze. Damien Cross stood on the deck of the ship, floodlight behind him, outlining his frame like a spectre carved from the dark. Cross tilted his head ever so slightly. "If you kill my stray," he said softly, "I'll simply replace him." Blake's breath came hard through his nose. Cross continued, voice barely louder than a whisper, but somehow carrying across the pier. "And if you keep chasing me, I will replace something you cannot." Something cold slid down Blake's spine. Cross wasn't threatening him. He was threatening Elena. Draven's lips curled. Blake felt the world tilt. Just for a moment. Then he shoved Draven away, but not off the catwalk. Not yet. The shooter stumbled back, clutching his ribs, eyes sharp despite pain. Cross smiled, a small surgical curve of the mouth. "Good," he murmured. "Now we can begin." Below them, an SUV's engine revved violently. Then another. Then all the floodlights snapped brighter, and the yard erupted into the next stage of hell. The floodlights blasted to full power all at once, blinding white beams flaring across the pier like a row of suns forced into existence. For a moment, Blake's vision dissolved into whiteness. Heat rolled off the lamps, turning the air thick and suffocating. Shadows stretched long and violent across the steel catwalk. Below, Cross's men surged forward in coordinated lines. No chaos, no shouting, just cold, efficient movement. They spread in perfect formation, herding the bikers into tighter pockets. It wasn't an ambush anymore, it was containment. Blake staggered once against the railing, eyes adjusting to the flood of light, muscles trembling from the fight with Draven. As the brightness settled, he finally saw the scale of what Cross had prepared. 2 more SUVs rolled in from the eastern entrance, engines rumbling with predatory calm. Cross's men moved around them like a well-trained unit, using the vehicles as moving shields to compress the yard into a kill box. Draven coughed beside him, still clutching his ribs, but he was smiling, blood on his lips, pride in his eyes. "You understand now," he rasped. "You never chased me. I led you." Blake didn't even look at him. His eyes stayed locked on Cross. Damien Cross began to descend the narrow gangway from the ship's deck with a composure that made the chaos beneath him seem irrelevant. Each step was deliberate, as if he were walking into a business meeting instead of a battlefield. The floodlights chased his shadow down the ramp, stretching it long behind him like a dark wound across the metal. When he reached the bottom, he didn't speak immediately. He simply took in the scene with a faint expression of mild disappointment, as if the destruction was unsightly rather than violent. One of his men stepped forward. "We've secured the perimeter." Cross gave a single nod. Then his eyes rose to Blake, still on the catwalk, breathing hard, fists clenched, blood dripping down his knuckles. Cross's voice was warm, almost paternal, when he spoke. "You came here for vengeance." Blake didn't answer. Cross continued, hands clasped behind his back. "But you brought your entire family into a trap they were never meant to survive." A rider below shouted back, raising a weapon. "We're not afraid of you." Cross didn't glance at him. One of his men did. A single suppressed shot cracked. The rider dropped. The entire pier went silent, not shocked, not frozen, just silent. Cross finally smiled, as if pleased by the quiet. "Fear isn't required," he murmured. "Just inevitability." Blake's grip on the railing tightened until the metal creaked. "You shot Elena," he said. "You'll die for that." Cross looked genuinely amused. "Elena Ward, your stray soldier, very inconvenient, very brave." His eyes sharpened. "But killing her was never the goal." Blake felt something in his chest twist painfully. Cross continued, tone softening into something dangerous. "No, Riker, she was struck because she stepped into a path meant for you." Draven straightened slightly, pride bristling in his stance. "I told you," he whispered. "You weren't the target. Your choices were." Blake lunged at him. Draven jerked back, but Blake caught his jacket, slamming him into the railing with such force the bars vibrated. Draven choked, struggling for breath as Blake pressed a forearm across his throat. "Say her name," Blake hissed. "One more time." Draven wheezed, clawing at Blake's arm. Cross spoke calmly from below. "You kill him, and you lose the only leverage you have." Blake didn't loosen his grip. Cross sighed. "Very well." He raised a hand. 3 muzzles snapped up simultaneously, pointed directly at Blake's chest. The sudden hush that followed was suffocating. Riders below saw it happening. Blake cornered on the catwalk, Draven pinned under his forearm, 3 rifles aimed upward. "Blake!" someone shouted. "Move!" Blake didn't move. He stared down at Cross, jaw clenched so tight the muscle twitched under his skin. Cross lowered his hand. "Let him go," Cross said, "and I allow your men to leave alive." A low growl of protest rippled through the bikers. "No deal. We stay together." "You think we're backing down?" Cross's men lifted their rifles toward the crowd. Cross didn't look away from Blake. "You understand better than they do," he said softly. "You know when you're outmatched." Blake's breathing slowed, or maybe the world around him sped up. He felt the cold night wind sting the sweat on his neck. He heard the faint hiss of the harbor, the creak of metal beneath his boots, and beneath the fury, beneath the hatred, beneath the iron taste of adrenaline, he felt one thing above all else, Elena's weakened voice in the dark. "Don't let him escape." He shoved Draven away, not gently. Draven collapsed to the walkway, coughing, gasping. Blake stayed where he was, back straight, eyes locked on Cross. "You said you'd let my men walk," Blake said, voice low. Cross smiled again, small and precise. And I will, a gesture, the guns lowered. Tension didn't. Cross's gaze flicked toward Draven. Get up! Draven staggered, wiped blood from his mouth, and limped to Cross's side on the dock floor. Cross looked him over with a faint air of disappointment. You brought them here cleanly, he said, but you allowed emotion to impair your timing. Draven stiffened. He was closer than Cross raised a hand, cutting him off. The dismissal was effortless. Blake watched the exchange, heart pounding in a steady, furious rhythm. Every instinct inside him screamed to leap from the catwalk and tear Cross apart with his bare hands. But he held still, because something was wrong. Something deeper than the trap, deeper than Draven's calculated retreat. Cross wanted him alive. He wanted all of them alive, for something else. Cross turned away, not dismissively, but with a quiet confidence that made the gesture even more insulting. We're done for tonight, he said, but understand this, Riker. He looked back up at the catwalk, and his voice hardened to ice. When a woman steps into a bullet for a man, she changes the balance of power. I cannot allow that. Blake's breath caught. Cross stepped closer to the edge of the ship's ramp, eyes narrow. Your Elena made herself a symbol tonight. You should not have let her. Blake's heartbeat became a hammer in his ears. Cross delivered the next sentence like a verdict. Symbols must be broken early. Fear punched Blake's chest in a way bullets couldn't. Cross turned to leave, guards closing in around him like shadows returning to a body. Draven followed him up the ramp, glancing once over his shoulder at Blake, not with defiance, not with triumph, but with something colder, promise. Blake stood frozen as the ship's floodlights dimmed one by one, plunging the pier back into the ghostly dark. Then the ship's engines rumbled to life. They were leaving, with a message Blake could not ignore. A hand landed on his shoulder. Jackson Creed's voice broke through the ringing in his ears. She's awake, he said, breathless. Elena, she's awake, Blake. She's asking for you. Something inside Blake snapped. Not fear, not weakness, something sharper, something that could tear down a city if pushed hard enough. He stared at the departing ship, jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. Then he whispered the only truth left inside him. This isn't over. The hospital lights were too bright. Not the clean, sterile kind of bright that made people feel safe, but the harsh, bleached white that made the world look cold and tired. Blake Riker pushed through the automatic doors with Jackson at his side, both still smelling of smoke and metal and war. Nurses looked up, eyes widening as they stepped instinctively out of the way. Even without their bikes, they carried the storm with them. Jackson led him down the hall, boots striking the tile in fast, uneven rhythm. His breath was still ragged, not from running, but from everything he witnessed on that pier. She woke up 10 minutes ago, he said. Barely. She's weak but conscious, asking for you. Blake didn't respond. He couldn't. Not while the sound of Cross's voice still echoed in his skull. Symbols must be broken early, and Draven's smile still painted itself behind his eyes. He pushed open the door to Elena's room. She lay beneath pale hospital sheets, tangled in wires and tubes and shadows, the faint glow from the monitors painting soft green patterns across her cheek. The wound was bandaged tightly along her ribs, the edge of the gauze peeking above the line of the blanket. But her eyes, those were the same, sharp, awake, full of the stubborn fire that refused to die even when everything else in her wanted to. Jackson stepped back into the hallway and quietly closed the door behind him, leaving them alone. Blake exhaled slowly. Elena. She turned her head toward his voice, the movement stiff but determined. Her lips parted in a faint, tired smile. You look terrible, she whispered. He almost laughed. It caught in his throat instead. He moved to her bedside, pulling the chair close but never taking his eyes off her face. "You took a bullet," he said quietly. "Don't worry about how I look." Her gaze softened. If you hadn't moved, Blake cut in, voice low, "I'd be the one in that bed." Her eyes didn't waver. "Then I moved exactly where I should have." His jaw tightened, not in anger, but in something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Something raw, human. He sat and gently took her hand, careful not to disturb the foreline taped to her wrist. "Elena," he murmured, "you don't understand what you did." "Yes, I do." She squeezed his fingers weakly. "I saw the shot. I reacted." Blake leaned forward, voice dropping into a whisper as though the walls themselves might betray them. Cross was there, the faint color in her face drained. "Damien Cross?" "Yes." The name settled over the room like a cold shadow. Elena swallowed, throat tight. "Then it's worse than we thought." Blake nodded slowly. He came to watch, not to shoot. Draven was just the lure. Elena closed her eyes briefly, a tremor passing through her breath. "He wanted you to follow." "He did." Blake's fingers tightened around hers. "And he wanted you gone." Silence stretched, thick, heavy, painful. Elena opened her eyes again. They shone with a mixture of exhaustion and something harder. "So what now?" Blake didn't answer immediately. He studied her face, the faint bruises along her cheek from the fall, the lines of pain that tightened around her eyes, the determination underneath every fragile breath. Her voice softened. "Blake?" He shook his head, emotion flickering through him like a storm behind calm eyes. "Cross said he'll break the symbol before it grows. He meant you—" Elena inhaled sharply, not in fear, but in understanding. "He sees me as a vector, a disruption." Her voice thinned. "A threat." Blake nodded once. "That makes this personal," she murmured. "No," Blake said quietly. "It makes you a target." Elena didn't flinch. "I've been a target before, not like this." "Blake," she whispered, "I'm not afraid." His eyes locked onto hers, and the truth of her words hit him harder than any punch that night. "You should be," he said, "because Cross doesn't send warnings, he sends endings." She held his gaze for a long, tender moment before speaking again. "Sit with me?" He hesitated only a second, then pulled the chair even closer. She shifted her hand in his, forming a loose, trembling grip. The beeping of the monitors softened into background noise. The harsh light melted into a dim glow as someone lowered the blinds outside. For a moment, one fragile, precious moment, they sat in the quiet space between war and grief. Elena's voice returned, softer. "Tell me what happened at the pier." Blake swallowed hard. He didn't want her to know, didn't want her to feel the weight he carried now, the weight of every man hurt, every bike shattered, every scream swallowed by gunfire. But she deserved the truth. "They were waiting for us," he said. "Cross brought an entire team, tactical, coordinated, trained, not street thugs." Elena's fingers tensed. "He's escalating." "He's declaring war," Blake corrected. The silence that followed wasn't fear, it was resolve thickening between them. A soft knock interrupted the moment. Jackson slipped inside, face taut, eyes flicking from Elena to Blake. "We have a problem," he said quietly. Blake stood immediately. "What kind of problem?" Jackson handed him a phone. Detective Mara Holt called. "She's at the station. You need to hear this." Blake lifted the phone to his ear, jaw already tightening. "Mara!" Her voice came sharp and urgent on the other end. "Blake, listen carefully. I pulled city cameras for the last 2 hours. Cross's men weren't just at the pier tonight." Blake's stomach turned cold. Where else were they? A beat of hesitation. "At the hospital." Elena heard it. Her breath hitched, pulse monitors spiking into a faster rhythm. Blake's voice dropped into a deadly whisper. Say it again. 2 men, Mara said. Same build, same patterns. They circled the building twice. One went inside for exactly 46 seconds. The room froze. Elena's hand clamped around Blake's. Blake, Mara continued. Cross knows she survived. He felt his heartbeat slow to a terrifying calm. How long do we have? He asked. Not long, Mara replied. They're testing the perimeter, and Blake, I think they're coming back. Jackson tensed, already reaching for his jacket. We should move her right now. No, Elena whispered, breath shaky. You can't. But Blake had already made his choice. He leaned down, pressing his forehead gently to hers for a single steadying second. You saved me, he whispered. Now it's my turn. Then he straightened and spoke with a voice that had no softness left in it. Jax, lock this floor. Jackson nodded sharply. On it, he sprinted out. Blake turned back to Elena. Her eyes glistened, not with fear, but with something heavier. Blake, she whispered, don't do anything reckless. He brushed a thumb over her knuckles. It's not reckless, he murmured. It's necessary. Footsteps echoed down the hall, club members rushing into position, pulling security around her room like a shield of bone and steel. The war hadn't reached them yet, but the night was bringing it closer. He squeezed Elena's hand one last time. I'll be right outside, he said, and when he stepped through that door, something in him hardened with a finality that felt like steel snapping into place. Nobody would touch her, not tonight, not ever, and if Cross wanted a war, Blake was ready to burn the city down to give it to him. The hallway outside Elena's room shifted from quiet hospital stillness to tense, controlled readiness. Blake stood in the center of it, shoulders squared, hands clenched at his sides. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered softly, not enough to be noticed on most nights. But tonight it felt like the building itself was holding its breath with them. Jackson returned first, 3 more bikers behind him, each posted at opposite ends of the hall. Their boots planted wide, their jackets creaked softly as they settled into position. The weight in their eyes said everything Blake refused to put into words. They weren't here as muscle, they were here as a wall. A nurse peeked out from behind the station desk, eyes wide, voice trembling. Sir, what's happening? Nothing you need to worry about, Blake said, tone clipped but calm. But I need everyone on this floor behind the nurses' station. No wandering, no open doors. The nurse swallowed hard. Oh, okay. She hurried away. Jackson stepped closer. 2 minutes ago, he murmured, one of my guys saw a grey sedan circling the block. No plates, windows tinted black. Blake's jaw tightened. Cross's men, most likely. Blake breathed once, slow, deliberate. They won't make it in, Jackson hesitated. Maybe, but if they're testing us, they're not afraid of a fight. Blake didn't blink. Neither am I. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, soft, hesitant. Detective Mara Holt appeared, badge hanging from her chain, coat half-buttoned, hair pulled back hastily as if she'd left the precinct in a rush. Her eyes found Blake instantly. I came as fast as I could, she said. We're stretched thin. The department won't send uniforms to a biker hospital lockdown unless they think it's a riot. Cross knows that. Blake didn't waste time. How many did you see on the cameras? 2 for certain, Mara replied. But Cross doesn't work in pairs. If he wants her gone, he'll send 6, maybe 8. Jackson cursed under his breath. Mara's gaze drifted to Elena's doorway, where a biker stood guard with his back straight and jaw tight. Is she stable? For now, Blake said. The detective nodded, then stepped closer, voice dropping. Listen to me, Blake. Cross doesn't kill out of anger. He kills out of purpose. If he's coming tonight, it's because letting her live changes something for him. It changes everything for me, Blake answered quietly. Mara studied his face, and something softened in her features. She knew what that meant. Everyone in the hallway did. Before she could respond, a sharp whistle cut through the air from the far end of the hall. One of the guards signaled, hand up, eyes narrowed through the narrow glass pane in the stairwell door. Movement, slow, deliberate, a shadow descending the stairwell. Every man in the corridor tensed at once. Blake raised a hand. Silent command, silent unity. They tightened formation around the door. Every breath locked. The stairwell door creaked. A leather boot slid into view. Blake's fingers curled into fists. Not a nurse, not a doctor. A man in dark clothing eased through the doorway, pausing just a fraction too long to scan the corridor. Professional, trained. His hand hovered near the inside of his jacket. Blake didn't wait. He moved with the kind of speed that came from instinct sharpened by necessity. One step, two, and he slammed the stranger against the wall, forearm digging into his throat. The man grunted, reaching for his jacket. Jackson was faster. A gun clattered to the floor as Jackson ripped it from the man's grip and shoved him down the hall. Mara snapped open her badge. "Police! Hands where we can see them!" The man didn't even look at her. His eyes locked on Blake. He smiled, and Blake felt the bottom drop out of his chest, not because of fear, because the man whispered she shouldn't have survived. Blake's fist crushed into the man's jaw before he finished the sentence, sending him sprawling to the tile. More footsteps echoed down the stairwell. Too many, too steady. Blake stepped in front of Elena's door, jaw clenched, eyes burning with something colder than rage. "Jax," he said quietly, "call every brother within 10 miles. Jackson's hand was already on his phone. Mara braced her stance beside Blake. "We don't have time for backup," she warned. Blake didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the stairwell. "They're not getting past me." The stairwell door burst open, not slowly, not cautiously. It slammed against the wall with a metal crack that shot through the corridor like a warning. 5 men pushed through in formation, dark clothing, gloves, identical expressions carved from discipline. No words, no hesitation. Crosses men. The hallway erupted. Blake stepped forward first. He didn't shout, didn't warn, didn't ask. He launched himself into the nearest attacker with a force that sent both of them crashing into the opposite wall. The man threw an elbow. Blake ducked under it, grabbed his vest, and rammed him headfirst into the fire extinguisher case. Glass shattered. The man dropped instantly. The others surged forward. Jackson intercepted one, tackling him into a rolling cart that toppled loudly, scattering trays and instruments across the floor. Mara Holt fired a stun round into another, dropping him to his knees before he could reach for his weapon. But 2 more broke through, straight toward Elena's door. Blake saw it happen in a flash. 2 shadows slipping past the chaos, boots pounding toward the fragile room at the end of the corridor. Something inside him snapped so hard it felt like bone. He tore free from the man he dropped, sprinting down the hall with a speed that didn't feel human. Jackson shouted behind him. Mara fired again. But Blake didn't hear any of it. All he heard was Elena's voice in his memory, weak, breathless, but steady. "Tell me what happens next." He wasn't going to let her see the end of that question. The first intruder reached the door handle. Blake hit him like a sledgehammer. His shoulder crashed into the man's ribs, the impact so violent it knocked the intruder off his feet and sent him sliding across the tile. Before the man could rise, Blake stomped down with his heel, pinning him by the throat. The second intruder drew a knife. Blake didn't slow. He grabbed the man's wrist mid-swing, twisted, and drove his fist into the man's sternum. A sharp crack. The man folded. Blake ripped the knife from his hand and flung it down the hall. Behind him, Elena's heart monitor beat faster, fear bleeding through the thin hospital walls. Blake froze. He heard her breathing, shallow, panicked. Alive! He turned back to the two downed intruders, chest lifting and falling with restrained fury. "You breathe wrong," he growled, "and I end you." One of them spat blood, eyes defiant, even as he gasped for air. "Cross! We'll finish what he started." Blake lifted him off the floor by the collar and slammed him against the wall hard enough to rattle the light fixtures. "Cross doesn't get near her. Not again. Not ever." The man smirked, blood painting his teeth red. "He already has." Jackson grabbed Blake's arm. Blake, let him go. Look." Blake didn't want to look. Didn't want to see anything except the target in front of him. But Jackson's voice cut through the haze, urgent and low. The window. Blake turned, and his blood went cold. Across the corridor, at the far end, a laser dot glowed faintly on the floor, then drifted upward across the wall, slowly, patiently, toward Elena's room. A sniper. Cross had planned for failure. He'd planned for Blake. He'd planned for everything. Blake's breath left him in one quiet, deadly exhale. "Mara," he said, voice like carved steel, "kill the lights." She didn't hesitate. She hit the breaker switch. The entire hallway collapsed into darkness. Someone shouted, someone cursed. Footsteps pounded, but Blake didn't wait. He moved through the dark like he'd lived in it his whole life. He reached Elena's door, shoved it open and closed it behind him with a soft, definitive click. The room was dim, moonlight spilling faintly through the blinds, painting Elena's face in silver. She looked up, startled. "Blake?" He crossed the room in 3 strides, placed a finger gently against her lips. "It's okay," he whispered. "I'm here." Outside, the hallway erupted in a storm of bodies, gunfire, shouting, a violent orchestra muffled by the hospital walls. Blake positioned himself between her bed and the window, shielding her with his body, breath steady despite the chaos. He listened. Every sound, every footstep, every shift of shadow outside. He would stand here until dawn if he had to, until she slept without fear, until Cross learned what it meant to threaten the wrong woman. Elena's fingers brushed his wrist weakly. "Blake, are we safe?" His jaw tightened. "Yes," he murmured. "You are." Because he wasn't leaving her. Not tonight. Not ever. Blake stood guard through the fading hours of the night, unmoving, unbroken, a wall of breath and bone between Elena and the darkness that wanted her gone. Cross had tried to break a symbol. Instead, he created 1, 2, standing together against everything he controlled, and the men who came for her left with a message carved into the night itself. She lived. He failed. This war was only beginning. But as the first hint of dawn touched the blinds, Elena's fingers curled around Blake's hand, and for a moment the world was quiet again, just 2 survivors breathing in the aftermath, knowing they would face whatever came next side by side. If this story moved you, subscribe to Heart Tales for more powerful emotional journeys, and tell us below, what would you fight to protect?